Right, this is just a part of a key report done by Spiroskouras on the PCR, how it's total fraud, or not fraud, it's being misused. And here is Kary Mullis, who just died in August, talking about his test, PCR, being used to detect HIV and call it the cause of AIDS. And he was to write a paper for the NIH that Fauci runs. And here's just a part of this.
They were thinking he should come up with a better answer than that.
That's the last scientist, Luc Montagnier, that he went to for an answer on how do we know, as I'm trying to write this paper, we know HIV causes AIDS. How do we know this?
And he just turned around and walked away. I really thought he'd have an answer. I really did. I mean, that was my last... I was right at the edge of my faith in the system. But I thought, Montagnier will know why he thinks HIV causes it. And he'll tell me. He'll say, because of this study. You know, but he didn't have that. None of those guys have that. And that's why they're so weird, you know. That's why they don't want to say. They don't want people like me walking up
Gallo
and asking them those kind of questions. And they're willing to, like, go to great lengths to prevent that. They're out on a limb. I wouldn't want to be there with them.
Almost chilling words at the end there from Mullis. They don't want people like him, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, around asking questions, and that they are willing to go to great lengths to prevent that. Mullis was indeed a thorn in the side of the establishment during the time of the HIV/AIDS debate. He was very outspoken towards people like Dr. Fauci. Here's a quote from Mullis on Fauci from a lengthy but fantastic article called "Was the COVID-19 test meant to detect the virus?" Quote, "What ABC needs to do is talk to Fauci and Gallo and show they're assholes, which I could do in 10 minutes, end quote. Now, personally, without knowing Mullis, I have to admit that I like him, and I have little doubt in my mind, from my own point of view, that if he were alive today, the powers that be would not be able to use PCR to perpetuate this manufactured crisis in the way that they are right now today. He was a thorn in their side then, and I'm sure he would have been an even bigger thorn in their side now. Now, this raises suspicions with me regarding the timing of his death just weeks before the outbreak. No disrespect to the family, and I have no proof at this point to go off of that. But again, the timing does raise some questions, I think, that should be looked into. Now, I'm going to play some more clips here. Some of these clips were sent to me. Some of them were put together by other people doing some great work out there, showing how the manipulation is taking place, and several examples of doctors calling out the lies.
Good afternoon, and we're starting off with the overall rates.
In the UK, apparently they're using holograms for news.
In terms of confirmed cases, as you can see on this graph, the numbers are now going up, and going up really much more rapidly.
The test that we have for the virus does not tell us whether we have an active virus in a person. It's being called by the media a case.
And the UK has recorded almost 3,000 new cases of coronavirus.
The rise in the number of cases that we've seen today is concerning.
A case is when someone gets sick from a disease. That's completely different from a positive test.
It's not a case at all. It's just that we can detect that at some time in the past, perhaps, there has been viral infection, but it's probably been removed now.
Even if there is some asymptomatic transmission, in all the history of respiratory-borne viruses of any type, asymptomatic transmission has never been the driver of outbreaks.
You must not meet socially in groups of more than 6. And if you do, you will be breaking the law.
It has what's been calculated as an infection fatality rate. That is, if you catch the infection, probability of you dying is 0.3%. So that means that 99.7% of people survive. 80% of people who catch this virus will be completely asymptomatic. Those people who do catch the virus, many of them, the effect will be like a bad flu. Those people who are actually hospitalized, then we do have very good treatments for these.
And anyone breaking the rules risks being dispersed, fined, and possibly arrested. As your Prime Minister, I must do what is necessary to stop the spread of the virus and to save lives.
Since when is our government, when is it their job to stop the spread of measles or a virus or anything like that.
Reaction is causing more deaths now and will cause far more deaths in the future than the virus itself.
Positive tests do not equal cases. Very important to remember. And I think that many would agree the response has been worse than the crisis itself. Now here is Dr. Thomas Cowan breaking down the PCR test and how it can be used to manipulate the crisis.
This explanation, just in a few minutes, is beautiful. I knew all along that the PCR is not to be, per Kary Mullis, not to be used to diagnose infection, viral infection, but I didn't know exactly how. But that there can be so many false positives. This explanation, basically, he's going to say the cycles. Depending on the cycles, you go under 35 cycles, almost everybody will test negative for this RNA that they're testing, fragment. And if you go to 60 cycles, everybody 100% of the time tests positive.
The test is called a RT-PCR test. It's otherwise known as a viral load test. And the test is a surrogate test. It was developed by a guy named Kary Mullis, who was given the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for essentially inventing the technique of this test. And he said very specifically, you cannot use this test to either prove infectious etiology or to diagnose an infectious disease, which of course is interesting because if you can't use it to diagnose an infectious disease, that of course begs the question of what can you use it for? But let me back up here and describe what a surrogate test means, because this is very important to understanding the situation we're currently in. A surrogate test means that in a situation where you're trying to prove causation, you have to have a gold standard test. And those postulates, like with meningococcus, that is a gold standard test. It's reliable 100% of the time. You cannot use a surrogate test to prove anything. And that is what is happening with these tests. So what is the surrogate test? So remember that we don't have a gold standard. We don't have isolation, purification, reinfection. We don't have viremia. We don't have millions of copies demonstrated on an electron microscope. We essentially have no idea who has this coronavirus disease. So then they take a piece of one of the coronaviruses, the new one that they found. It has a new RNA sequence that hasn't been found before. They take one of the sequences, which they say is unique to that particular virus, and they do something called amplify it. And what that means is you take it in your blood, you'll have one copy of this sequence, and it's too small, you can't find it. So you stimulate it, and this is what Kary Mullis came up with. You stimulate it, it makes 2 copies. That's 1 cycle. You make 4 copies. That's 2. You make 2 to the 20th copies, whatever number that is. That's 20 cycles. And what you find with this test is that once you put it through approximately 36 cycles, then you start to see the color change that tells you it's positive. So if you do 35 cycles, it's still too small to see. If you do 36, you start to see it, but you get false negatives, even though you don't really know which is a false negative because you don't have anything to compare it with. So then you do 37 and you see it, 5% of the time of people with these symptoms, and you say that's the number. But here's where it gets interesting. If you do it 40 times, you start seeing a lot more positives. And then here's something else to know. If you do it 60 times, so if you amplify it over and over and over again, it becomes positive with 100% of the people. Let me say that again. If you amplify it 60 times, it will be positive with everybody. That means that everybody has a piece of this RNA somewhere in their cells or in their genome or somewhere in their secretions. All you have to do is amplify it enough. And the problem is we don't know how many false positives or false negatives there are because we have nothing to compare it to. And if all biological tests have false positives, so if you test 30 million people and you have a 1% false positive rate, then 300,000 people by definition will test positive, and then you have an epidemic. And then if you want to demonstrate that the epidemic got better, all you have to do is lower the amplification cycles to 35, and then suddenly your, vitamin C or your vaccine or your chloroquine or whatever you did worked, and now there's no more people testing positive. That is fraught with problems, and that is the problem. And unfortunately, with every country has their own standard of what kind of cycles they put it through, the number. So you see very different numbers coming out of very different places, depending on the number of amplification cycles that they're standardizing their test to. And I hope everybody is getting the point that this is a crazy situation.
A crazy situation indeed. A manufactured crisis, in my opinion. A very astute point made by Dr. Cowan. Depending on the amount of amplifications, you can affect the positive or negative rates. So you could have a very high amplification rate in the numbers, and therefore would have a very high positivity rate in the cases, or the tests, right? Then you roll out the vaccine and lower the amplification during the tests, and then you would get less positive cases, right? And hey, wouldn't you know it, then you have an effective vaccine. Now, this last clip is from Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis.
All right. This is, that really is crucial information that just in every day, all these cities and states, they're showing us the test cases, case rates, and it's all bogus, all of it. So this needs to be, please share this. I'm going to put the link to this video. It's 26 minutes long. He includes more about Kary Mullis, the maker of PCR, in the beginning, and then Florida's governor asking some pertinent questions about the testing and track and trace. So, okay.